Good afternoon, everybody. When we were backstage, Dominic said to me, I'm finishing on Nelson Mandela. And I said, of course, that's exactly the best link to bring me in. I am so much like Nelson Mandela, of course. It's been a fantastic day here today. I met one of the pupils from the school here earlier, who was amazing. And we were chatting about her exams. And I said, what would you like to do in the future? And she said, I want to be in the Navy. I thought, God, that's amazing. Are you in cadets? And she said, no, I just really want to travel. And I thought, could you not just become like an EasyJet pilot or something to do that? And then she said, no, it's many different things. But one of them is that I really love this country and I want to serve and I think it's important to be patriotic. And I thought, wow, these guys have really got fundamental British values just absolutely nailed in this area. And I thought it was interesting that you've got such articulate young people who are able to explain their hopes and their dreams for the future. I thought it was fantastic. So my name is Laura McInerney. I'm an education journalist. Before that, I was a teacher. And before that, many, many years ago, I used to work in management consultancy, which is a slightly awkward thing to admit sometimes. But I had a brilliant boss. His name was Richard Nixon. And at big events like this that they would put on, he would often speak near the end of the day. And so he would make us take part in something to ensure he had attention. So I'm afraid, guys, it is the bit with the audience participation. You won't have to get out of your seat. There's going to be none of that. But what he used to make us do was he would say bang, and the audience would say job done. So I'm going to say bang, and you guys say job done. Let's try this once. Bang. Job done. That's excellent. Bang. Job done. And bang. Job done. Excellent. So we have come through an event today. I feel like we have all survived through something. I think you've all got through the traffic this morning, correct? Bang. Job done. You've got your grab and go lunches. Bang. Job done. And now you've got this final bit to get through. Now, what I've been asked to do is talk a little bit about education policy. And one way of doing that is to use something I used to do with my Year 11 class when I was giving them feedback. And I would talk through the good, the bad, and the ugly of what I had seen in my marking. And actually, there is quite a bit of good news. Within the secondary sector, and start there has been a huge amount of change. So last year, English and Maths colleagues, you had to deal with the change in GCSEs. Many more of you this year will have to change, and next year, some of you will have just started with your Year 10s with the new GCSEs. But the good news is, that's settling now. Those lesson plans that you're writing, you should be able to use those in the future. You'll start to understand the schemes of work better. Textbooks might even arrive for your subject, which would be quite nice for those who've been waiting. And in primary, we've got the same situation. Assessment has been changing, and everybody knows it's been a real nightmare getting rid of levels without much being put in place, having to rip up the entire national curriculum. I always felt that primary colleagues had it much harder. There's the secondary colleagues moaning because they've lost levels for their one subject, and primary colleagues had the entire national curriculum all ripped up. But ultimately, that's starting to bed down. Damien Hines, the Education Secretary, has promised no more curriculum changes, no more assessment changes. You will have to deal with the multiplication check in primary, but even that looks like it isn't going to be such a big deal. So in terms of curriculum and assessment, we are at a good phase. In fact, we are at bang. We'll have to do that again. I'm sorry, I know I'm going to be like that teacher in assembly who's making sure we all stand up again and we get quiet and we sit down. Bang. Thank you. So there is some good news. However, I am never asked to come and do a talk because everybody wants the easy answers. They don't just want you to walk out of here feeling good, although we might get to that. There are some bad things that are going on. In particular, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. That is a bank vault, and it is bare. In terms of finances, the sector is not in a good situation. I wrote a Guardian column this week in which I pointed out that around 25% of local authority schools spent more than they had last year, and that was over 50% for academies. If you include depreciation, it's actually 80%. So we are in circumstances with schools where it is more costly to keep the level of service than the cash that's coming in. And I wish that I had great news for you on this. But the current Education Secretary, Damien Hines, has been very, very clear that he doesn't think the solution to any real problem in education is more cash. So if you want to do something, and you want to change something in your setting, we're going to need to get really innovative about how we do it. And I'm afraid it's going to get even bleaker, because that graph is showing you the birth rate over the last sort of half a century or so. And if you look on that top line, it's blue and it's dotted, what you can see is a dip right near the end. It's just from the early 2000s if you look along the bottom axis. And that's the dip we're currently in demographically in secondary schools. So primary, you've just had loads and loads of children through your doors. But secondary schools for the last few years have had falling rolls. Now it might seem like that's not too much of a problem. It was quite nice having smaller GCSE classes for a few years. But it adds up to a major problem for the teaching profession. You see, 21-year-olds are the cannon fodder of teaching. They are who we hope to bring in as the bright young things, and they're who work really, really hard, do a lot of the extracurricular activities, and who we train up to become the leaders and department heads and executive principals of tomorrow. We have a serious problem when we get to this dip. So your current Year 11 are a very, very small cohort nationally. And unfortunately, as they go through university, they stay a very, very small group. And that means that when they're 21, the teaching profession has a very small pool to pick from. It will decrease that pool every year from now until the current 16-year-olds are 21. So there is a diminishing number of graduates available who want to do the job, simply because there are a diminishing number of graduates available. Not because teaching is awful, not because we talk it down, not because of workload, purely because demographics are against us. There are not going to be as many young people around in the next 5 years. And that means when other jobs are fighting for them and they can put more pay in, and they can put in job opportunities abroad, school and teaching are going to have to fight even harder. And there's an even bigger challenge than that. In 2015, over at Schools Week, we did an investigation in which we found out that more additional teachers went abroad that year to teach than studied for PGCEs. Let me put that into context. Across the globe, around 80,000 British-trained teachers go and work in British schools abroad. Now, those schools are fantastic. Some of you will have taught in them. They're brilliant. They're a great opportunity for people to go and teach abroad for a few years. But they're also expanding. And they're expanding at such a rate that in 1 year alone, that number went from 80,000 teachers to 100,000 teachers. We lost 20,000 British-trained teachers to British schools abroad in 1 year. That same year, we only trained just over 19,000 teachers through PGCEs. A few more were done in school and through Teach First, but actually, we are losing massive amounts of staff abroad. So one of the solutions that the government keeps suggesting is more flexible working. And flexible working can mean many different things. It could mean looking at your out-of-office email policies. It could mean around whether you have to come in early or go home late. But one of the big things we're hearing, not just at Schools Week, but through the work I do with TeacherTapp that surveys over 2,000 teachers each day, what we're hearing is teachers saying increasingly they want to do part-time work. And they're saying, I would like Friday at home, because on Friday I could catch up with all of my lesson planning and my paperwork and the things I'm supposed to magically do during my PPA time, which gets sucked up with fights. You laugh because it's true. And ultimately they're saying, I want to work at home for free on a Friday so that I can have a weekend with my friends and my family. But what that means is we are essentially saying to those very few 21-year-olds who are facing enormous amounts of debt and sky-high house prices, that actually, unless you can afford to work 4 days, you're going to have to work 5 and never have a weekend. And I have another worry about the flexible working issue. When we've surveyed teachers, even taking into account their salaries, around half are saying that they would drop to a 4-day week. And everyone tells me this is great. It would get loads of people back into the profession if we could do part-time work. But here's the reality. If 40% of Britain's teachers dropped 1 day per week, we would need an extra 40,000 full-time teachers just to cover their workload.
So that's the equivalent of 2 sets of PGCEs who were already losing abroad, or it's the equivalent of 10% of everybody who's ever left the profession coming back full time. And bearing in mind that the argument is supposed to be that actually they would want to come back part-time, you'd possibly be looking at around 20% of everybody who's ever left coming back to plug that gap. So in terms of the education policy landscape, in terms of curriculum and assessment, things are in a good place. As a department, as an individual classroom teacher, I think over the next 3 years you can really get your teaching really solid. But we are going to be up against some really tricky times in terms of getting people in the door. And that may mean having more supply teachers, it may mean being more flexible with moving people between schools, and it means as a profession, we have to think about how together we make this job manageable. I was in a school last week where they guarantee that teachers only ever write 12 lesson plans per term. And they do it via a coordinated plan of lesson planning within the school. Standalone academy, not exciting, not an amazing trust, just a group of teachers that sat down and really worked out how they could make their working life better for each other. And it's that spirit, it's that tiny little thing that you might be able to do to make life better that I think is going to matter so much. Because even though I've given you a really bleak picture at this point, I do have something slightly more inspirational up my sleeve. And it's this guy. Can I see any flickers of recognition on anyone's face? Not seeing anyone. This guy is George Tomlinson. And in 1947, he became the Education Secretary. Now I want you to think about that. 1947. He was the second ever Education Secretary in Britain. And if you think we are facing a demographic bulge, if secondary school is scared of the group that's about to come through because they're so big, imagine in 1947 knowing that you're facing the biggest baby bulge post-war that this country has ever seen, and they are on the way. And if you think the teacher shortage is bad now, it wasn't that there weren't many 21-year-olds because they hadn't been born. 21-year-olds had been sent off to war. 21-year-olds weren't coming home. So this guy has an enormous baby bulge on the way. He has hardly any young people in his country. On top of that, the schools have been flattened. I get upset about building schools for the future being cancelled in my school, but my school was originally flattened during the war. So he's got no people, he's got loads of children on the way, he's got no buildings, and there's absolutely no cash because the schools are fully in deficit. And you know what George Tomlinson does? He's part of a team that raises the school leaving age. He doesn't complain, he doesn't say it's impossible, he doesn't go back to Parliament and says he can't do it, and there's one simple reason why. You see, George Tomlinson is the only Education Secretary who didn't have a secondary education. George Tomlinson was born in Rushden in Lancashire. He was born into a mill factory family. And at the age of 12, although he absolutely loved school, he had to leave. And so he had to go and work in the mill, and he had one opportunity. He could become a preacher, and in doing so, he'd be able to go back to school. But to do that, he had to pass exams. So every day, he would go to the mill at 6:30, and he would come home at 6:30 p.m. He would then eat his dinner, and he would go to sleep because he was tired. But between midnight and 1 a.m., he would wake back up, and he would sit by candlelight, and he would study. And he did this for years and years and years until he was old enough, he was around 17, to do his studies and his exams. And he had 3 exams to pass. And he passed the first one, and he passed the second one. And for his third one, he had to go all the way down to London. It was his first ever trip. And then he got back, and he stayed back, because he failed that exam. And that was it. 1919 in Rushden, Lancashire, that was his option. He had to go back to the mill and stay with his looms. Now he worked his way up, he went into the shop stewards, he became a union man, he became an MP, and eventually he became the Education Secretary. And the day that he did, the Spectator magazine ran an article in which they called him an ignoramus. And he said, they say there's an ignoramus down at the Department for Education. Well, let me tell you this. It's only a man who's never had an education that can tell you why it's so important. And so him, like you, had a reason why he did this job. Even though he had no people, even though he had no buildings, even though he had no money, The reason he raised the school leaving age was because he knew how much it mattered. And so the thing with teaching is we have to try and find those small wins. One of the things that George Tomlinson did was he started the emergency teacher scheme. He literally filled halls like this, sports halls, and just got everybody from local villages and local towns in, and he said, I'm going to find the teachers amongst you and I'm going to train you as best I can. We will find you the equivalent of schools direct or apprenticeships or whatever else you need, because I believe that everybody deserves these chances. And you will have your own story. You will have your own reasons why you're in education. And it may be that the vaults are bare. And it may be that there are hardly any 21-year-olds. And it may be that secondary colleagues in particular, you've got a baby bulge on the way, but it is always possible to take that spirit, the spirit of George Tomlinson, the spirit of 1947, the spirit of the story that makes you want to be a teacher, and forget about this. The good, the bad, the ugly, it will always be there. Something good will always be happening, something bad will always be happening, something ugly will happen. But you are able to make the change. Maybe it's about your lesson planning, maybe it's about how you get teachers into your school. There is always something that you can do. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is BANG. Thank you.